Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Meg. I'm so pleased to be invited to this panel today on identity, justice, and placemaking. Thanks to DCP for imagining such a theme. In 2005, I was an architecture student in Ireland with an interest in how extreme environmental hazards impact the built environment. My first research activity was collecting data after Hurricane Katrina. I set out to survey building damage, but when I spent time along the Gulf Coast and met people affected, I realized that this disaster was about much more than just the hurricane, storm surge, or floodwaters. It was about a society that allowed risks to be created and unequally distributed. My interest in disasters took me into a PhD program and into South Asia for my doctoral work. Since 2008, I've been working in a field context where English is the dominant operational language, but often not the language of the people affected. The dominant language of disaster response and recovery is English. Over my years of research in disasters, I've worked in many countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Beginning with my work in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, I've become more and more aware that disasters are a site of contested power. Disasters are about politics and class and race and the economy, inequality and injustice. You might be familiar with the way that opportunities for social, political, and economic change emerge in disasters. The existing power structure is fragile for just a moment. Humanitarian practitioners and disaster researchers arrive into this contested space. An underappreciated part of this power struggle is disaster terminology and translation. In my field of research, disaster studies, the English language is dominant, and this matters. The way that we conceptualize and understand disasters affects our attitudes and behaviors as we respond to real-world problems. What if our norms in terminology and translation were inhibiting social transformation at the local level? Would we be willing to cede power and influence? Next slide, please. There are many critical terms that are important in disaster studies. Being a relatively new field of research, these terms are often adapted from elsewhere. Look at the 6 disaster terms on this slide. You may have a preferred definition for some of them, and you may even have a strong feeling about one or more, but there's no single meaning for any of them. I chose this image because depending on which door you choose for any of these terms, you might go into a very different looking room and never reemerge. Take resilience, for instance. In engineering, it looks very different to what it does in ecology or in psychology. So you see, meaning is encoded in disaster terminology, and research and practice can both become problematic when disaster terms are conceptualized too narrowly. Over the past few months, I've been rethinking vulnerability in particular. If you rush into an understanding where the term vulnerability is imbued with characteristics of only weakness or lack, you might never realize that in radical feminist literature, the same term has such liberating potential. The different meanings encoded in disaster terminology emerge from ideological perspectives and demonstrate political agendas. This is why continuous interrogation of our assumptions and the development of new theory is so important, even as we strive for practical progress. The bottom line is that disaster terminology is contested in the academic space primarily, while in policy and practice, encoded meaning is broadly apolitical, and it is predominantly Anglophone. Next slide, please. Discourses around disaster terminology have been something I've had interest in for many years. But in 2017, I started to talk to my colleague Ksenia Chmatina from Loughborough University in the UK about something more specific. Ksenia and I host the podcast Disasters Deconstructed, where a central theme is the meaning of disaster terms. We knew that disaster research and practice was dominated by English language conceptualizations, but we then started to talk about what this dominance actually means for the researcher, the practitioner, the person in the community facing a disaster recovery process. The dominance of English in research is a relatively new phenomenon. Up until World War I, French and German languages were dominant in many parts of the world, reflecting the ideas of Eurocentricity imposed around the world over centuries of colonization and exploitation. A Eurocentric approach continues to drive all aspects of disaster risk management, as well as emergency response and recovery. Usage of Anglophone terminology and the underlying meanings among NGOs, research institutions, and intergovernmental actors cements the practice. This enforces power by creating the language norms, by which you get published, win grants, and achieve policymaker buy-in. Those who play by these rules are more successful according to all academic metrics. And this concerned us greatly. We reached out to the disaster research and practitioner community to help us translate the 6 key terms that I previously outlined, first from English into other languages, and then back into English, so that we could try to understand the variety of meanings around the world. Let's take the term vulnerability as an example. Almost all translations that we receive reflected the meaning of weakness. In Chichewa, the 2 different words that have 2 different meanings, the term used in disaster jargon means to be without anything. In daily life, a word is used to describe a lack of protection. Resilience provided a really interesting set of translations. These range from adaptability, elasticity, and flexibility to firmness, endurance, and strength, to resistance, survivability, and tolerance. A range of meanings sometimes even appeared within the same language. One translation that we appreciated was Afrikaans, where the word means bouncy bouncy. A native speaker thinks of an athlete ready to jump. Next slide, please. I mentioned Eurocentricity previously. This sort of approach posits that modern science has only been possible due to intellectual, social, and cultural influences within Europe. Ideas, practices, and traditions from outside Europe, on the other hand, are frequently either deemed to have little value or neglected entirely. Disaster research continues to center ideas and methodologies from this Eurocentric tradition. We might view translation as a mechanical operation capable of producing precise equivalents of meaning between language, but it's so much more creative and ambiguous than that. Because of long-standing power differentials, when translation from English to a so-called peripheral language occurs, the translator tries to emulate the original. Exceptions include the work of Habermas, Derrida, and Foucault, and these are regarded as difficult texts in the Anglophone world because of how closely they hew to German and French word choice and structures. So what happens when we translate a disaster term from English into a so-called peripheral language? Well, typically we use what's called a foreignizing approach. The original conceptualization is presumed to be the most important and correct. But we actually see the reverse dynamic when translating disaster language back into English. The origin of terminology is masked so that those reading the translation might eventually see resilience, where a translation prioritizing the source language would be bouncy bouncy. What could we learn about disasters from people around the world if we took time to look at things in a different way? Would our research have more impact if we learned from individuals and communities in their own voice, in their own terms? As a researcher, I asked myself, how do I perpetuate systems of oppression and injustice? Well, first of all, research on disaster-affected people, even when in the Anglophone world, that does not center the voice of those affected and challenge the power dynamics that create risk for them, is a missed opportunity and an ethical misstep. Next slide, please. So what can we do? In the disaster field, I think we need to extend our thinking about ethics, power, and responsibility to the issue of translation. We need to consider our own positionality. Where do we stand in relation to dynamics of power and privilege? Something we can do is challenge insider status conferred by using the right Anglophone language. Maybe your field is something like disaster studies. Maybe you're further on, and discussions of decolonization, for instance, are in a healthy place. For disaster studies, part of the struggle is challenging the sometimes vehement deference to dominant languages and cultures. This deference often comes from a place of deep privilege and fear of losing it. I spoke about the approaches to translation, domesticating and foreignizing. I want to return to this in closing. Ksenia and I recently had our first paper related to the study accepted with our co-authors Amir Abukhalev, a PhD candidate working with me in Rinker School, and Neil Sadler, a linguist at the Queen's University of Belfast in the UK. In the paper, we argue that disaster studies as a field would benefit from completely flipping the script on translation. We argue for a domesticating approach out of English and a foreignizing approach into English. This is not a neutral stance. It is an anti-oppressive one. Destabilization would be very healthy in this instance. Language has always been a political tool to exert influence, strength, and power. And we live in a world that is becoming more and more globalized and where decisions are made at a high level. These terms are imbued with the power to not only decide what information is to be conveyed, but also who is to be informed. Thank you all for your time. It's been such a privilege to share these thoughts. The paper that we wrote should be out very soon, so please get in touch if you would like to learn more. Thank you.